Welcome to part 3 on our segment related to global contemporary art. Our first artist that we're going to be looking at is Jeff Koons. This is called Pink Panther, done in 1988. It's glazed porcelain. So again, this is sort of an unusual image, very different than what we've seen. I mean, we have seen, women depicted in the nude and sort of objectified, but, also this sort of infusion of pop culture and this idea of kitsch we'll talk about as well. But imagine walking into an art gallery and seeing overgrown toys or cartoon characters presented as sculptures. If in 1988 you had wandered into the Sonnabend Gallery on West Broadway in New York City, this is indeed what you would have witnessed. It was an exhibition entitled Banality by the New York artist Jeff Koons, presenting some 20 sculptures in porcelain and polychrome wood. The work certainly strikes as an affront to taste. The sculptures are highly polished and gleaming. The colors, muted pale blue, pink, lavender, green, and yellowish gold, seem to belong to the 1950s and 1960s. Chloe, be quiet! Hush! I'm sorry, my dogs. The glossy textures look garish and factory-made, surfaces one associates with inexpensive commercial art. So these kind of like little kitsch figurines, like gnomes and, stuff like that. Sorry about that. One would almost want to call these sculptures figurines, like tiny little figurines, if it wasn't for their size. To add to this catalog of horrors, the artist had farmed out the actual production to German and Italian artists who made each work in triplicate. Banality thus debuted simultaneously in New York, Chicago, and Cologne. So, a glazed porcelain statue entitled Pink Panther belongs to that body of work. It depicts a smiling, bare-breasted blonde woman scantily clad in a mint green dress, head tilted back to the left as if addressing a crowd of onlookers. The figure is based on the 1960s B-list Hollywood star Jane Mansfield. Here she clutches a limp pink panther in her left hand, while her right hand covers an exposed breast. From behind, one sees that the pink panther has its head thrown over her shoulder and wears an expression of hapless weariness. It, too, is a product of Hollywood fantasy. The movie of the same name debuted the cartoon character in 1963. The colors are almost antiquated. Do they harken back to the popular culture of pre-civil rights era as a politically regressive statement of nostalgia? And what about the female figure posed in a state of dishabille or carelessly and partially undressed? At a time of increased feminist presence in the still-dominated art world, this could only be perceived as a rearguard move. Or was Koons a postmodern provocateur like no other, simply parroting male authority as he'd done in some of his other work? So again, this work, instigated a lot of questions and, again, a lot of different interpretations. And that's what's so interesting about, I think, contemporary work, that, you really, it's not just about religion or, politics, but it really becomes more complex than that because our society is so complex now. All right, so this is another artist. We'll be talking about her in a little bit in more detail, Cindy Sherman. But we are going to be talking about, she's important in understanding some of these sort of avant-garde modernist movements, as well as this idea of postmodernism. We sort of touched on it when we looked at some architecture, but we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about it. So provocation is a mainstay of modernist avant-gardes, reaching at least back as far as Marcel Duchamp's Fountain of 1917, an ordinary urinal was proposed as an artwork. Avant-garde, again, refers to artists who challenge established ideas. But whereas Duchamp eventually accrued near mythical status, the same critical response for Koons was not forthcoming. Here, I'm going to go back. In fact, he would become one of the first artists of this period to achieve a level of success that depended more on the art market than on art criticism. He is still reviled. Only recently a review described Koons as Duchamp, with lots of ostentatious trimmings. It's easy to see why he continued to provoke the postmodern 1980s, inaugurated the contemporary sense of the artist as a critical and serious interrogator of mass culture and mass media. Cindy Sherman, one of the most prominent artists of this period, made photographs of herself that parodied cliches of femininity before an audience that consumed critical theory about the constructed nature of reality and the oppressive manipulation of mass media. Her work was understood as a deconstruction, shorthand for the examination and analysis of the elements of gender stereotypes. Another predominant postmodern artist of this period, Christophe Wadziko, used high-powered projectors to cast politically charged imagery onto corporate facades after dark, imagery that often pointed to economic and social contradictions, and prompted public discourse with an ephemeral and often provocative public space. Here are some examples of Christophe Wadziko, and I know I'm butchering his name, but these are some of the projections he posted. Again, if I don't have too much time to talk about him, but, obviously if you're interested in any artist that we kind of mention in context when we're talking more in depth about another one, certainly please look it up and learn more about it if you're interested. Now getting back to Jeff Koons. So postmodern artists were supposed to counter the banality of evil that lurked behind public and popular culture, not giddily reveal it as Koons seemed to do. There appeared to be nothing serious about any of the works in the banality exhibition. You've probably seen this work of Michael Jackson. So a life-size bust of pop icon Michael Jackson and his pet monkey Bubble. And, of course, Pink Panther, a work that seemed destined to insult rather than informed. It all seemed like kitsch, Kitsch, posing as high art. So what is kitsch? The American art critic Clement Greenberg once defined it as the opposite of what truly progressive avant-garde modernism embodied. Greenberg advocated for a modern art that was true to its materials, such as the gestural abstraction of the New York school artists like Jackson Pollock, who splattered and spilt paint in abstract fashion on unprimed canvas, declaring a direct creative confrontation that was raw and honest. Kitsch, a word from German origin, refers to mass-produced imagery designed to please and broadcast possible audiences with objects of questionable taste. So think of objects and images with popular, sentimental subject matter and style. So here you can see this little Hummel figurine called Little Boo Boo, where he looks like he's taking care of the bear. I guess the bear got a boo-boo. Postmodern art attacked Greenberg's influential theory of modern art, creating images in direct opposition to modernism. While modernism championed painting, form, and originality, postmodernism foregrounded photography, subject matter, and the reproduction and responded to modernism's search for the profound by presenting this idea of these sort of banal aspects of experience. So, these experiences that I guess were everyday. Postmodernism grounded a rarefied atmosphere of genius that was prevalent in modernism in the politics of everyday life. But postmodernism postmodernism stopped short of fully embracing kitsch by inciting on a degree of self-aware critical distance. This is where Jeff Koons found a fault line that he fully exploited with works like Pink Panther. Hummel figurines and other popular collector items are the basis for the art and banality. Koons renders these sort of sentimental little figural groupings, cartoonish emblems of childhood innocence, at a life scale, as an assault upon sincerity, but also as an assault upon taste. And it is here that even the most daring postmodern advocates drew a line in the sand. Like the modernist distinction between art and everyday objects drawn by Greenberg, Pink Panther challenged the distinction between an ironic appropriation of a mass cultural object and the object itself, seemingly without critical distance, thereby challenging the whole critical enterprise of postmodernism itself. Yeah, I know that's pretty deep. So anyway, again, you certainly can go back and review my lecture notes, because I know this whole idea of postmodernism is difficult to sort of take in, but it's just so complex, and there's just a lot going on. But, really some of the main ideas is that Jeff Koons is sort of, in a similar way like Marcel Duchamp is trying to kind of push or question, I think, this idea of what is considered art, what is high art, what is low art, and why are certain artworks represented or in a certain canon of great art, and what makes, what are the criteria for that. Here you have these life-size sculptures, which you would think would be a canon or part of the criteria. He outsourced this work to, very skilled artisans, Italian and French, ceramic and designers. So, these are questions that, a lot of artists, try to push the envelope with. And so, in a lot of ways, Jeff Koons, I think, is making fun of the whole art market, because he actually is a very successful artist. So, anyway. Alright, so I told you we'd be exploring all different kinds of media, so we are going to be talking about Cindy Sherman. We briefly discussed her when we were looking at the work of Jeff Koons and trying to, figure out what this idea of postmodern art represents. So on my left is a photograph. It's a self-portrait of Cindy Sherman as a sort of a history portrait. And what you see on the right is an old master painting done, by Caravaggio, Baroque painting of Judith beheads Holofernes. So this is that biblical story. So there's some interesting comparisons we can make in terms of the media of photography and painting, and then also the presentation of the subject matter, and then also this idea of Cindy Sherman using herself as a model. So there's lots of interesting things that we'll get to explore. So walking through a contemporary art wing in a museum, one may be surprised to come across a 7-foot-high oil painting of the biblical heroine Judith holding the head of Holofernes. How is an old master canvas, that is a work of art from the revered European tradition, seemingly created in the 16th century, hung in such a mistaken place? Judith looks boldly out at her audience and presents the head of Holofernes in her right hand, displaying the dagger she used to decapitate him in her left. She is garbed in billowing red, blue, and green drapery and stands in front of a curtain made of pieces of brocade and patterned fabric. Her head is tilted slightly to her left, much like the heroine in the painting by Botticelli and other artists. But unlike Botticelli, here, let me show you Botticelli. I don't know why I don't have that. Hold on. All right, sorry about that. So here are two paintings by Sandro Botticelli. The one closest to, that's on my right is, we've studied this. This is the image he did of Venus. And then this is a version he did of the return of Judith to Bethula. So when we compare the two, we see that Cindy Sherman, her head is sort of tilted to the left, much like a lot of the heroines and paintings by Botticelli. She likewise stands on a carpet of green grass speckled with flowers, but unlike Botticelli's pristine and idealized nudes, Judith's makeup is heavy-handed, almost tacky. The fabrics that at first seem to glimmer are, upon closer inspection, chintzy and cheap, and Holofernes' head, which is usually frightening and powerful, looks like a used Halloween mask. There is no old master painting at all. In fact, the slick surface of the picture quickly reveals that it's not even an oil painting, but an actual monumental photograph. She's done it again. The contemporary master Cindy Sherman, known for embodying and acting images from popular media, has imagined or reimagined a Renaissance painting, the interpretation of the Old Testament hero Judith, and photographed herself in the part. And she's initially done this with just enough illusion to confuse the viewer, even if it's only for a moment. So I'm going to kind of zoom in so you can see a better look. Oh, God, I'm so sorry. Hush! Chloe? So here you get a better sense that this is a photograph. So this image done by Cindy Sherman is part of a series she did called History Portraits, and this is untitled 228. This body of work was completed from 1988 to 90 while the artist was living in Rome. However, she did not go and visit the great works of Italian Renaissance and Baroque art that was all around her, but rather chose to look at them as reproductions and books. In this way, she remained a consumer of print culture, utilizing only what images were available to any person anywhere in the world. So, and here's the image of Caravaggio. So I was just trying to show you different interpretations of this type of sort of like history or religious painting. So this is an earlier work she did, and this is really where she became an acclaimed photographer. She did this series called Untitled Film Stills, and this was created a decade earlier, from 1977 through 80, in which the photographer dressed as a film heroine and created scenes that appear to have come from classic movies. But you really, it's like these images that we think we've seen in movies, these kind of old black and white movies, but they're still sort of ambiguous and they're not really specific. Sherman never recreated specific images, but rather used the original media as inspiration for her own art. Thus, the photographs feel both familiar and original, contemporary and classic, and create a feeling of unsettled anxiety in the audience. So this was a huge, in terms of photography, she probably is the first photographer that really broke through and actually became known as an artist. That's something that, artists working in different media, some artists don't think photographers are real artists, because of this element of reproduction in their work. But Cindy Sherman really sort of kind of hurdled that wall and really kind of broke through and was one of the first people or photographers to be considered an artist, a great fine artist. So as you can see, when we look at Untitled, let me go back, 228, she draws upon Renaissance and Baroque images of Judith with the head of Holofernes. The Book of Judith, included in some versions of the Bible, tells of the devout widow Judith, a heroine who saves the Israelites from a conquering Assyrian general by befriending him and visiting his tent one night while he is drunk. She takes advantage of his unfit state and decapitates him. The Assyrians, shocked by the assassination of their leader, retreat, and the Israelites are saved. So I'm going to go back to this image. Because she uses her sexuality to kill Holofernes, and because she is a woman who is able to murder a man, Judith has always been a heroine that engendered a great anxiety. So this idea of a woman, who's capable of, in many ways usurping a man's power, obviously has been this sort of figure of probably male anxiety to a certain extent. Cindy Sherman's photograph captures that. She's dressed in red, the color of lust and seduction, as well as the color of blood. She fills the entire length of the 7-foot-tall photograph, so it is a very large-scale image. In fact, her head and feet are both cropped, indicating that she is so large she cannot be contained by the image, while her face is Holofernes is grotesque and comedic, it's basically a Halloween mask. And although Sherman's interpretation of Judith has much in common with Cristofano Allery, his version of painting of the same subject, both in the amount of color and saturation of the fabric and the pose of the body, it is also heavily reminiscent of Benedetto Cellini's Florentine Perusis with head of Medusa, which is you see here, this statue. It's likely that Allori, also a Florentine, was inspired by Cellini's sculpture too. In Sherman's photograph, it is the woman, not the man, who is in control of vital force. And so here you can see I forgot to put the image of Cindy Sherman's photograph, so you can make a comparison with the painting I talked about earlier. So we'll just look at the photograph now. So one of the questions that pops up is that a lot of feminists, obviously because of the subject matter and this idea of Judith being a woman that, creates anxiety and, has usurped a male power, has obviously been embraced by feminists. But there has been a question, even with her earlier work, the untitled film stills, the black and whites that we saw earlier, whether, she really thought of herself as a feminist. So because of her subject matter, Sherman is often considered a feminist artist. She did indeed come of age during the feminist movement in America, and tackles issues regarding female identity and sexuality, as well as pornography and media objectification of women. Sherman has said that she hopes that her work is understood as feminist in nature, but that she never intentionally created feminist art. And so I think that is a very important statement. Another misconception is that her photographs are self-portraits, but in the same year that she created Untitled 228, Sherman explained to the New York Times that in looking at the portraits, she often did not see herself in them at all. Rather, she thought she disappeared while creating the character. So she doesn't consider these self-portraits. She really, I guess in her mind just sort of embodies this character, and it doesn't really have anything to do with her identity. I find that a little hard to believe, but Sherman is still an active artist and continues to inspire contemporary artists, including people like James Franco, who remade her film still series, and Jimmy Eat World, whose rock album Invented was based on Sherman's Au revoir. It is perhaps because of this idea of self-invention that her art remains so popular. It is perhaps because of, we may see her photographs over and over, but we are never sure of what she looks like. Her art is both a regurgitation of the past and a re-imaging of it. She asks us to look at her, but she also looks at us. She's victimized and victimizes. Her art embodies all of our own bodily and psychological insecurities, our fears about our fluid identities in an unstable world, and the angst of finding oneself in a world in which we must always perform. All right, so we're gonna jump again. We're kind of jumping all over the board here. We're gonna be looking at a painting. This is done by Juan Quick to See, So as a response to the 500th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival in North America in 1992, the artist Juan Quick-to-See Smith from the Confederate Salish and Kootenai tribes of the Flatland Indian Nation created a large mixed media canvas called Trade. And then there's, in parentheses, gifts for trading land with white people. Trade, part of the series, the quintessentiary non-celebration, so it's part of a series, illustrates historical and contemporary inequalities between Native Americans and the United States government. Trade references the role of trade goods in allegorical stories, like the acquisition of the island of Manhattan by Dutch colonists in 1626 from unnamed Native Americans in exchange for goods worth 60 guilders, or $24. So stories like this have become part of an American lore suggesting that Native Americans have been lured off their land by inexpensive trade goods. The fundamental misunderstanding between the native and non-native worlds, especially the notion of private ownership of land, underlies trade. Smith stated that if trade could speak, it might say, "Why won't you consider trading the land we handed over to you for these silly trinkets that so honor us? Sound like a bad deal? Well, that's the deal you gave us." Let me zoom in so you can get a better sense. So, like some artists like de Kooning, she's incorporating paint, but also media and collage onto the canvas as well. For Trade, Smith layered images, paint, and objects on the surface of the canvas, suggesting layers of history and complexity. It's divided into 3 large panels. The triptych, so it is a 3-part arrangement, is reminiscent of a medieval altarpiece. Smith covered the canvas in collage with newspaper articles about native life cut out from her tribal paper, charcosta, photos, comics, tobacco, and gum wrappers, fruit cartons, labels, ads, and pages from comic books, all of which feature stereotypical images of Native Americans, are sort of embedded into the painting. She mixed the collage text with photos of deer, buffalo, and Native men in historic dress holding pipes with feathers in their hair, an image of Ken Plenty horses, a character from one of Smith's earlier pieces, the paper dolls, for a post-Columbian world, with ensembles contributed by U.S. government from 1991 to 1992. That's the title. We'll get some other elements to it. She applied blocks of white here. We go back. She's applied blocks of white, yellow, green, and especially red paint over the layers of collage materials. The color red has multiple meanings for Smith, referring to her native heritage, as well as to blood, warfare, anger, and sacrifice. With the emphasis on prominent brushstrokes and the dripping block of paint, Smith cited the abstract expressionist movement from the 1940s and 50s, with raw brushstrokes describing deep emotion and social chaos. For a final layer, she painted the outlines of an almost life-size canoe. Canoes were used by Native Americans as well as non-Native explorers and traders in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th century to travel along the waterways of North America. The canoes suggest the possibility of trade and cultural connections, though this empty canoe is stuck, unable to move. Above the canvas, Smith strung a clothesline from which she dangles a variety of Native-themed toys and souvenirs, especially from sports teams with Native American mascots. The items include toy tomahawks, a child's headdress with brightly dyed feathers, red man chewing tobacco, a Washington Redskins cap, and a license plate, a Florida State Seminole bumper sticker, a Cleveland Indian pennant and cap, Atlanta Braves license plate, a beaded belt, a toy quiver with an arrow, and a plastic Indian doll. Smith offers these cheap goods in exchange for the lands that were lost, reversing the historic sale of land for trinkets. These items also serve as reminders of how native life had been commodified, turning native cultural objects into cheap items sold without a true understanding of what the original meanings were. And here's a detail where you can actually see the objects that she's incorporated, and also the technique she used in painting and collage. So she was born on January 15th, 1940 at St. Agnasta Jesuit missionary on the reservation of the Flathead Nation. Raised by her father, a rodeo rider and a horse trader, Smith was one of 11 children. Her first name comes from the French word for yellow, Juan, I'm probably saying that wrong, Jaune, a reminder of her French Cree ancestors. Her middle name, Quick to See, was not a reference to her eyesight, but was given by her Shoshone grandmother as a sign of her ability to grasp things readily. From an early age, Smith wanted to be an artist. As a child, she herself photographed She photographed herself while dressed as Henry de Letouche-Lautrec. Though her father was not literate, education was important to Smith. So she received a Bachelor of Arts from Farmington State College in Massachusetts in 1976 in art education, rather than in studio art, because her instructors told her that no woman could have a career as an artist, though they acknowledged that she was more skilled than the men in her class. In 1980, she received a Master of Fine Arts from the University of New Mexico. She was inspired by both native and non-native sources, including petroglyphs, plains ledger art, Dene saddle blankets, and early Charles Russell prints of Western landscapes, and paintings by 20th century artists such as Paul Klee, Joe Miro, William de Kooning, Jasper Johns, and especially Kurt Schwitters and Robert Rauschenberg. So what you're looking at here is an image done by Robert Rauschenberg. Both Schwitters and Rauschenberg bought objects, and incorporated these kind of sculptures into their painting, and these kind of ephemeral objects like tickets, cigarette wrappers, strings, and so forth. So Robert Rauschenberg, and again, he wasn't included on the list of AP, the 250 works, and I talked about him a little bit, I think briefly, in another segment. But he really is a fantastic painter, and I think when you look and compare it to Juan Quick to See, you really do see the influence there. And this idea of how appropriation, incorporating collage and photography and this sort of mass media, and then how paint is really not paint, it's more of this residue for these paintings, and then Rauschenberg would incorporate almost sculptural elements to his work as well. So Smith's art shares her view of the world, offering her personal perspective as an artist, a Native American, and a woman. Her work creates a dialogue between the art and its viewers and explores issues of Native identity, and is seen by both Native Americans and non-natives. Trade, gifts for trading land with white people, restates the standard narrative of the history of the United States, specifically the desire to expand beyond sea to shining sea, as encompassed in the ideology of manifest destiny, the belief in the destiny of Western expansion, and raises the issues of contemporary inequalities that are rooted in colonial experience. Right. So that is the end of that segment. There is going to be a part 4, 5, and 6, I'm sure, but I love this work of art. I'm so glad that I was able to get to contemporary art. I think next year I'll probably start with this first, and then start with go in a chronological order, but anyway, stay tuned for part 4. And as usual, if there are any Khan Academy videos that I've uploaded related to this segment that we're looking at in terms of contemporary art, please view those.